Were the chairs at the Daily Show comfortable?
I remember being in the green room.
Yeah.
I remember being on the wings of the stage. I don't really remember being on stage.
That's fair.
Other than waving at the crowd at the end. So it was kind of a blur.
How do we deal with the messiness of life? How do we find purpose? We try to answer that by talking to the risk takers, the big thinkers, and the ones who love breaking the mold. And when we're feeling playful, we hide cash in unexpected spots around the US, around the world maybe, just to see who's up for a little adventure. Our guest today is BYRON TAU, the man who uncovered how tech and government have teamed up to watch us all. After a killer career at the Wall Street Journal, he's now at Notice, continuing to expose how corporations have turned our data into a surveillance machine. BYRON is shining a light on tech's darkest secrets. I'm Jay Mays, and this is SEARED, the pursuit of purpose.
Thanks for coming all the way out.
Thanks for having me.
Baby boom generation, Generation X, millennials have given a lot of their data away for free, unintentionally. Is that an accurate characterization?
I think so. I think at this point, almost all generations, anyone living in America has had their data vacuumed up in some way, shape, or form by corporations, by governments, just because that's the way our economy is set up. That's where all the incentives point.
Are there laws out there on the books today to address the technology that's used to collect the data as it stands now?
Well, it sort of depends. Congress has in the past passed privacy laws, right? That's why we have privacy laws around things like medical data. That's why we have, there's laws around wiretapping telephones. But when you're talking about digital information, things that come off of modern internet networks, off of cell phones, off of advertising networks, that has tended to be largely unregulated. Europe and some American states have made some efforts to pass privacy laws, but by and large, Congress sort of stopped legislating on privacy in the 21st century, just as things like Facebook and advertising networks and mobile phones became an ever bigger part of our culture and of our economy. And the result is that these companies make lots and lots of money collecting data off of hundreds of millions, if not billions of people worldwide.
Let's talk about phones first, just to make this real for people. A lot of people have cell phones. What type of data is collected off a cell phone?
Well, at the sort of carrier level, your cell phone carrier knows a lot about you, right? They know your name, they know your address. Often they'll do a credit pull if they're kind of giving you a phone and hoping that you'll pay it back over time through the monthly plan. So they know a fair amount about you, including often your approximate location at any time, because that's how they deliver cell phone service to you. And then the manufacturer of the phone, whether it's Apple or Google or another company, Samsung, they often know a lot about you, right? Because they're the ones that built the operating system. And they put things in there like maps, or they put other services in there that collect information about your location. So they can serve you the weather, or they can tell you where to get pizza, or how to get somewhere, how to serve ads to you in their sort of native podcasting apps, for example. So those companies know a lot about you. And then whatever else you put on your phone, whether it's apps, games, whatever you load on there, there are often hundreds, if not thousands, of parties that are collecting some sort of data from each one of those apps. Some of them are the app publisher themselves, right? Because, the mapping app knows where you are or where you're going. So does the weather app. Sometimes games ask for your location so they can get your physical location in the world. And then lots and lots of advertisers advertise inside apps. And in order to serve you targeted advertising, they usually want to know something about you. So they collect a lot of information about you, unique identifiers that are assigned by companies like Apple and Google. And then, they start serving targeted ads at you, and hundreds, if not thousands of companies are in a position to do that. So there's this vast web of data collection around all of the devices and all of the online services that we use every day.
Oh, man. Just on our cell phone. You were wearing an Oura ring earlier, correct?
Yes.
I have a Garmin GPS watch, Meta Ray-Bans. We talked about the glasses. Probably the same for all of those technologies too.
Yeah, and those biometric sensors that we strap to ourselves now, often for perfectly good purposes. My Or a Ring tells me when I'm stressed or how poor I'm sleeping, or reminds me that when I drink alcohol that it really does a number on my body. So these are sort of good things for some people. Apple Watch has a bunch of like very good health features, including it can detect irregular heartbeat. So there are good reasons for this, but that also just adds another level of data that's being collected about us at any given moment, and we have to entrust these companies that make these biometric devices that they'll take their responsibility seriously and not sell our data, or not misuse our data, or not be hacked by some nefarious actor that wants access to it.
So cell phones, other devices we carry on us, those are sources of our data. What about our transactions and our credit cards? Let's talk about those sources of data.
Yeah, so almost everything in the world is becoming more and more digitized. At one point, we used to pay for things in cash, and cash has largely been supplanted by some sort of a digital payment service, mostly credit cards, but we also have services like Apple and Google Pay that are, helping us spend money in physical locations or on the internet. And then there's web services like Venmo and PayPal and others that help do peer-to-peer transactions and sometimes transactions with merchants. And so all of that data can be collected, and there's a robust market for sort of point of sale transaction data by lots of companies who sell it to Wall Street firms to do analysis on it. There's all sorts of data brokers that are in a position to collect information about your credit score and your address history. And so there's a lot of information that comes off of financial transactions. All of that generates logs, all that generates data.
Once it goes to these, first parties, are they selling the data? Are they working with data brokers to exchange the data? What happens next?
Yeah, it's hard to generalize across all companies.
Sure.
Some companies take privacy a lot more seriously than others, and some of that is often because of the kind of data they have, and others make their bones off of selling and trading information with other companies. But by and large, there is a robust ecosystem for either trading or selling information because consumer information is valuable. Targeted advertising is $1 billion business, and the result is that these companies are sitting on lots of interesting consumer information, addresses, consumer propensity, what consumers are interested in, often how much money they spend, their zip code, their names, all of that is out there, and companies collect it, and often they can find a willing buyer as a secondary source of revenue for their enterprise.
It's not only corporations that are consuming this data and potentially ad networks, but there's government entities consuming this data as well. And that's really the crux of your book.
Yeah, so that's what I've been researching for the past few years, first as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and then in my recent book, Means of Control. Because data is generated by consumers and users of tech services, and there are data brokers out there that buy it. There's just this giant market for selling consumer data, and governments have the same needs as corporations in many ways. Like corporations, they're trying to understand the world. They're trying to do things like public health, public safety. They're running military campaigns. They're doing counterterrorism. And the data that corporations collect is often quite valuable for those kind of missions as well. And so there is this sort of quiet relationship between data brokers and governments to sell large amounts of consumer information to government entities, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's the military, whether it's intelligence agencies, or whether it's public health agencies who are trying to do things like pandemic prevention or contact tracing. And there's even more benign uses like transportation planning. A lot of departments of transportation use this kind of data to determine how many people drive to work versus how many people take the bus.
As you kind of establish who's collecting this data, you're not saying this is a bad use of data, this is a great use of this data. It sounds pretty balanced so far. There's some good uses for all this data that's being collected. There's some uses like advertising for this data that's being collected. Are there nefarious uses as well?
Well, it depends what you mean by nefarious.
Sure.
I certainly think that government agencies with a law enforcement, intelligence, or a sort of national security mission deserve a lot of scrutiny when they use data like this, right? Because they are the ones that can visit the most serious consequences on people. When you're talking about corporations, the stakes are that they serve the wrong ad, or they waste a little bit of money marketing to people who don't want to be marketed to, or in some cases it can result in the denial of a job or not getting a mortgage or something. So there are real stakes on the corporate side. But when you're talking about government entities that have the power to arrest you, that are making life and death decisions, that can put you on a watch list and restrict your ability to travel or to do transactions. And when they're using this kind of data in the shadows, that's what really raises, I think, what are profound civil liberties and privacy questions about just how much power and information do we want in the hands of the state. It's not necessarily that these government entities are evil or they're doing bad things or that their missions are wrong.
Right.
It's more that historically we have limited the power of government by limiting the amount of information that powerful government agencies have. That's how we have protected people's liberty and how we've protected people's privacy. But with the amount of information that's just out there available for the taking or that's available for sale, that balance, that traditional notion of limiting government that way is starting to shift way more in the favor of the state. States have a lot more information about their citizens and can do a lot more things without going to a judge and getting a warrant or filling out all that pesky paperwork. Often they can buy it from data brokers, and that information is quite revealing.
They don't need a warrant. They just buy it. Fact, governments do important work, but most consumers have no idea how their data is being used. Corporations are cashing in, selling your digital life while you hand it over for free. Your phone tracks you, everything you do. You think it's just about free games, free apps, free email? Think again. It's about profit. Private companies act as intermediaries, selling your personal information and rake in billions, while you are surveilled by the highest bidder.
You had many examples in your book that made this tangible, going back, I think, to pre 9/11 all the way up into now. What are some of the examples that really stand out as maybe not an entire misuse, but at least an illustrative for the power of this data in government hands?
Yeah, so after 9/11, there was a realization that a lot of the story of the hijackers could be told through these corporate transaction records. So there's actually an amazing document that I looked at as part of my research for the book, and it was essentially a chronology of the 9/11 hijacking from the birth of the oldest hijacker right up until a few days after 9/11 when some mail arrived at the old apartment of one of the hijackers. And this was a detailed chronology of every step you needed to plan the attack. And when you start to read this chronology, you'll realize just how many of the steps, how many of these bullet points that the FBI lists in this chronology are drawn from some sort of corporate record, right? A car rental, a travel record, a credit card transaction, a gym membership. They went out and got every scrap of paper from these hijackers, and a lot of those scraps of paper were in the hands of private sector companies. And they realized, hey, we can tell a pretty detailed story about this attack through this kind of data. And so that kind of data became interesting to investigators because they started to say, well, what if we could, get all of the travel records for the whole country? Or what if we could get all the transaction records for the whole country and start looking for patterns, something like the 9/11 hijackers showed before the attacks, right? Some of them weren't paying their credit card bills. Some of them were making confounding trips that make no sense. Some of them were buying things that didn't make any sense. They were bouncing around apartments. You had these government records. Some of them didn't have valid visas or overstayed their visa. So there became this hope among certain government agencies that if you could get enough data and combine corporate data with the government's classified data, you could start to look for patterns and suspicious behavior in these large data sets. And so that really, I think, illustrated to a lot of people that corporate data was valuable. It wasn't just the government's secret intelligence information. If you were in a position to capture, say, credit card transaction records or travel records or car rental records, you could tell a pretty rich story about the population and look for people who are doing things that are somewhat suspicious. And so that was kind of the animating hope at the time. And that is a through line through the whole book that, there were some early experimental programs after 9/11 that tried to do this, and governments right up to the present day are trying to do the same thing with different kinds of data.
It started, so right around 9/11, the data that was available was a lot of consumer data and transaction data, right? Instead of fair classification.
Yep.
After that, soon after that, you had social networks that came online, or maybe even pretty close to that, right? Maybe MySpace and then Facebook in 2005, et cetera. That was a new well of data at that point. The next well of data would be mobile phones. What's the next iteration beyond that?
In my book, I call it gray data, and that's just a term that comes out of sort of the intelligence community.
Sure.
And that means it's stuff that's not secret, it's not classified, but it's not published through a traditional publisher. So think a think tank report, that's gray literature. Think a sales brochure from a company, that's gray literature. Gray data is just like that. It's data that isn't traditionally brokered by data brokers, but can be collected by certain entities if they know where to look. So the big example I talk about in the book is wireless data. So when that Oura ring we were talking about, or that Apple Watch, or your AirPods that are in your pocket, those are emitting wireless radio frequency data all the time.
With the UID often.
Right. Often with a unique identifier that doesn't change. And while your name is not attached to that set of AirPods, it certainly can be collected by anyone who has the right antenna. And if you distribute enough antennas around the world, you could have a pretty interesting look at where things go, and those things are usually proxies for people.
Can you give the example of the car tires?
I think the car tire example really sticks with people.
Yeah, I think so.
If you hop in your car that's been built after 2005 or 2006, it will often warn you when your tire pressure is low. And that's a very important and useful safety mechanism. It's in there because of a federal regulation, and it's in there for perfectly legitimate safety reasons. But the way that your car knows that its tire pressure is low is not because there's a wire running from the axle up to the car's central computer. It's because there's a little battery-powered sensor inside the tire that pings at certain intervals a little message to the central computer of the car, and it says, my tire pressure is 42 psi, all is good. In addition to pinging with the tire pressure, it also has a unique tire identifier, right? It will say, I am Accurate tire number 35725A, and my tire pressure is this. The thing governments and hackers and others have figured out is anyone can listen to that transmission because it's wireless, it's unsecured, it's unencrypted.
Clear text.
Clear text. So if you have the right antenna, you know what frequency or what band it's in, you can listen to it, you can vacuum it up, you can save it. And so governments have figured out, hey, if we put little sensors on bridges or at the end of a street, we can capture the radio transmission of the car tire. And that car tire is a proxy for the car. And that car is a proxy for a person. So we can derive interesting information from that car tire transmission. And it's not just car tires, right? That was the example I used that's sort of memorable, but you can do the same thing with AirPods. You can do the same thing with the wireless radio on your cell phone that's looking for the nearest Wi-Fi base station to connect to. Those are all wireless technologies. And when that data is lost, when it's stolen, when it's hacked, that can have privacy implications for people, even if there's no name in that data set. If you know approximately where I live and where I work, you can probably figure out who I am if you had movement records for everyone moving around DC, using their phones as a proxy. And the thing is, nobody intended AirPods to be used as a tracking system. But the fact is that we design these things, for the easiest and most convenient possible use without any thinking through the security implications of having, of carrying around things that just constantly scream their presence along with a unique identifier, which sometimes never rotates. And the result is it can be used for surveillance, and it's difficult to unwind that kind of surveillance once it's entrenched.
Shocking, right? But here's the kicker. Corporations are gobbling up your data like it's an all-you-can-eat buffet. They don't just want a piece of the pie, they want the whole damn bakery. And guess what? You're the source. You're handing it over for free. Every search, every click, every swipe, everywhere you go. Tracked. You think you're the customer? No. You think you're the product? Wrong again. You're the supply chain. You're the cow. And they're making a fortune off your digital crumbs, selling it to the highest bidder while you stay in the dark. And uncompensated. De-identified or not, they know it's you. Shoshana Zuboff calls it surveillance capitalism. You're not the product, you're the raw material.
There's de-identified data, but I assume there's groups out there that are attempting to, buy the de-identified and then re-identify and apply their own analysis to that data. And anything they build off of that data is theirs from a proprietary perspective, right?
That's right. So often transforming data or deriving inferences from it means that it's now your data set. There are companies out there that are, that can match your supposedly de-identified or anonymized Apple or Google assigned advertising ID. Some companies very openly offer that services to other marketers. They say, you give us a list of these anonymized ad IDs and we will give you someone's name. Other companies do this for geolocation data. They'll say, if we know the location of a phone down to the residential address, we can do matching for you. We can match the property ownership records and other data broker records and try to give you an approximation of who that person is or what household they belong to. And then we can bring along all sorts of other information from things like loyalty cards and frequent flyer programs, things that are done at the household level. And so there's this entire ecosystem of data brokers and data matching services and data enrichment services that will take your supposedly de-identified data that the consumer was told was collected with no personally identifiable information, and then straight up try to re-identify the same people on the other end.
How has surveillance technology evolved in the past decade relative to consumer data?
So I think governments are increasingly relying on consumer information or commercial information that they buy. Governments have always spied. It's nothing new to surveil people. We in the 50s, in the 20th century, we saw the government, opening mail and, tapping the telegraph wires and tapping the telephones. So governments have always spied and have always taken advantage of technologies to do it. I think what's changing is that a lot of information is now in the hands of the private sector, and some portion of that information is available as just a straight, ordinary commercial transaction. And even when it's not, often spy agencies can, with a wink or a nod or a request to the right executive, get information from web services that have consumer data on people. It's not bulk surveillance, but they can go to a web service like an email provider or a messaging platform and say, we really need a favor. You have terrorists using your network, or you have Russian spies communicating on your platform for the good of the United States. Would you please hand over those messages? And they can come back with a court order if they don't comply. So private sector entities have become a much richer target for information, for surveillance, and for spying. And you can do real, meaningful intelligence with it. And so I think that's really what's changing.
We talked about what types of data, we talked about the who's collecting, and we talked about a couple of uses. Let's take this from the perspective of someone who carries around their phone every day, isn't doing any nefarious activities, or at least nothing that would be awful. What should people feel and think about this relationship between the government and the commercial gathering of their data, of the power of what they're carrying in their pocket, and how much data it's collecting on them, how it's being used for ads? Like, what should the consumer start to really process and understand about this?
Yeah, it's a good question. And you do hear a lot of times, people say, well, I'm not doing anything wrong.
Yeah.
What do I have to worry about? And I do think, there are examples, say, of people whose phones put them at the wrong place at the wrong time and who
Sure.
came under suspicion because their device pinged near a robbery or near a kidnapping. There have certainly been examples where facial recognition algorithms have identified the wrong person. People have been arrested. People have lost their job for this. So these computer systems that are relying on data are imperfect, and often human beings use them sloppily. And often they're doing so without tremendously good checks and balances on exactly what's being acquired and how it's being used. And so actual innocent people have been swept up in criminal investigations, for example, and I'm certain it's happened on the national security side too, but we probably have less information about it. And then we've seen some really kind of horrendous privacy violations happen to ordinary people who aren't really committing crimes, but they're not doing things that they necessarily want public. So there's an example, a famous example of a Catholic priest who was using Grindr. Nothing wrong with using Grindr, but the Catholic Church has a stance on both homosexuality as well as sexual relations by its clergy. And this priest was using this app, and it was generating a log of data. And a group of Catholic journalists actually obtained Grindr data from a commercial data broker and managed to identify that one specific Catholic official, a priest, was using this app, and he lost his job. So there can be real consequences for people, either things they don't necessarily want public, or they might be accidentally misidentified by a system that collected real data, but the analyst made a mistake when trying to parcel out who's the suspect in the bank robbery or the kidnapping.
I do have at least a couple of friends, one of them knows exactly who he is too, that say, I'm not doing anything wrong. I don't care who has my data. And to me, that always seemed, I don't know, just like wildly short-sighted. Again, he knows exactly who he is. So I'm going to point to him on camera because he'll watch this. But to me, it's never been a fair trade-off, like service for data. And that's really the culture that we're in right now, is you trade off your data for a free app on your phone, or, you trade off your personality or your profile for a social network and a connection to someone else. That's always seemed imbalanced to me.
I'm stealing this line from Glenn Greenwald, but you should ask your friend the next time he says, I have nothing to hide. And you should say, well, give me your phone and let me, rifle through your emails and your text messages. I'd like to see it. Can give me an hour with it and let me run some search terms and I'll give it right back to you. Yeah. I just don't believe that people sort of have nothing to hide. Right. Even if they're not doing something illegal, we all say catty things about people in our lives. We all say things on digital devices that we don't intend for public consumption. Every single one of us.
Absolutely.
And so, people don't really behave that way in real life, that they don't care about every remark they've ever said being public. But yet somehow when something migrates to a digital platform and we're open to talking about their precise location all the time, or when they're talking about every email they've ever sent, somehow the principles change, or their calculation changes. And I don't think that's healthy, and I don't think it's true, right? Glenn has said this on panels, and he said he's never gotten one taker from when he asks, all right, give me your phone. Give me an hour with your phone and I'll give it back to you. So I don't really think people really believe that if pressed.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's go back to the first question and talk about, I'd asked about the different generations and how they were affected by this data collection. I have young members in my family, nieces, nephews, et cetera. They're coming up in an era of data ubiquity, more so than I did, more so than our parents did. If there's going to be a policy shift, is it going to be from the zeitgeist, kind of from popular opinion, from consumers, from the younger generation? Or are we in this new era of data collection, and will we always be in that sort of era?
It's a good question. And, in DC where I live, a lot of people talk about regulation, they talk about privacy laws, they talk about policies and executive orders. But I do fundamentally think if there is going to be a shift in how technology is used. It's going to have to come in a lot of ways from the consumer, right? Who is also a voter and also decides who to send to Washington or their state capital to represent them. Consumers have to decide at the end of the day, and voters, what they're willing to accept when it comes to technology. And I do think, some of the social norms have probably changed permanently, right? Like, I think all of us understand that there are tremendous benefits to these technologies, that they are convenient, that they are useful, that there is a place in our lives for them, and that may result in some amount of data collection. At the same time, consumers also have to decide where to draw the line, right? Do we want companies to know everything about us, to scan through our emails and serve us targeted ads based on that, to digitize every scrap of information, including our medical records and our mental health notes from our conversations with our therapists, and just have them lost in data breaches or stolen or accidentally left on the open internet to be scanned and saved by malicious hackers. So consumers really are going to have to decide what they're willing to spend their money on, what services they're willing to use, and where they're going to draw lines around both corporate and government access to their most private information.
Whew. Eye-opening stuff, right? But trust me, we've barely scratched the surface. In the next episode, we dive even deeper into how these companies are profiting from your every move. Stick around, because if you thought this was wild, the next one will blow your mind.
One, take two, session 5.
In the first iteration of SEARED, we would just clap at the cameras and line them up that way. So this is Mark 5. This is a new version, so that's nice.
Nice. Never seen one of those clipboards in real life.
Yeah, and that one's digital and pretty nice, really.